After my wife passed away and my sons kicked me out of the house, I was working as a driver when I picked up a passenger at a hospital. An old man got into the car and just froze, staring at me. He asked, with a trembling voice, if I was a Garcia. I told him I was. He started to cry and told me he had been looking for my family for 60 years. He took me to an office and opened an old safe covered in dust. His hands shook as he turned the combination. He told me that my father had saved his company from bankruptcy in 1965, but he had never received the shares he was promised. When he finally opened that safe and showed me the documents, when I saw the amount of money that had accumulated over decades, I forgot how to breathe. But to understand why that moment both destroyed and saved me, I need to tell you how I got there, driving a cab at 73 years old, with no family and no hope. 6 months before that day, I had a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had a small house, a wife who had been my partner for 45 years, and 2 sons who I thought loved me. Patricia was everything to me. Every morning, she would make coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar. That smell of fresh coffee was my routine, my comfort, my home. When cancer took her in March, in less than 3 months, that smell disappeared forever, and with it went everything I knew. The first few days after the funeral were a blur of pain and silence. The house that once overflowed with her laughter now only had echoes. Moses and Ethan, my sons, came to visit me for the first few weeks. They brought pre-made food and empty words, but I noticed something different in their eyes. They no longer saw me as their father. They saw me as a problem that needed a solution, and that solution arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after we buried my wife. Moses knocked on my door with papers in his hand and a cold expression I had never seen on him before. He made me sit at the kitchen table. He explained that the house was in Patricia's name, that legally it now belonged to them, and that they had decided to sell it because they needed the money. Their own families, their own debts. I asked them where they expected me to live. Ethan, the younger one, answered without looking me in the eye. He said I should look for a small apartment, something I could afford on my retirement pension. My pension was $400 a month. It was barely enough to buy food. I told them this, my voice breaking. Moses just shrugged. He told me they couldn't support me, that they had their own responsibilities. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My own sons, the boys I carried in my arms, who I drove to school every morning, were throwing me out on the street as if I were nothing. 2 weeks later, I was living in a rented room that cost $300 a month. It was the size of a closet. The walls were a filthy yellow. It smelled like dampness and the neighbors' cigarettes. The window looked out onto an alley where trash piled up. There was no kitchen, just an electric hot plate and a small refrigerator that made a constant humming noise. The bathroom was shared with 3 other tenants. The mattress had springs that dug into my back. It was all I could afford, and it still only left me with $100 a month for food. The nights were unbearable. I would lie awake staring at the stains on the ceiling, listening to the neighbors fighting through the thin walls. I wondered how I had ended up here. 73 years of life, 45 years of marriage, 2 sons raised with love, and there I was, alone and abandoned in a room that felt like a prison cell. I thought about Patricia constantly. I wondered if she could see me from wherever she was. Hunger doesn't care about pride. After 2 weeks of eating only bread and canned beans, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't survive on $100 a month. I signed up to be a driver for a ride-sharing app. I thought no one would accept me, a 73-year-old man competing with young people, but I was approved in 2 days. They gave me a sticker for my windshield and access to the app. That was it. The first day, I almost crashed 3 times. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. The passengers got in rushed, some friendly, others rude. I tried to focus on not getting lost, on not making mistakes. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a stranger, a gaunt man with deep, dark circles under his eyes. I had lost over 20 pounds since Patricia's death. I worked 12 hours a day, sometimes 14, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. My legs would swell so much I could barely walk. My back burned with constant pain, but I couldn't stop. Every ride meant $3, $4, $5. I stopped buying anything that wasn't necessary. No coffee, no meat, just rice, beans, and cheap bread. Sundays were a special kind of torture. They used to be sacred days. Patricia would cook her famous roasted chicken. The kids would come over with their families. The house would fill with laughter. Now, Sundays were just another work day. Another day of picking up strangers and listening to snippets of their happy lives while I was dying inside. families going to lunch together, elderly couples holding hands. Every trip was a painful reminder of everything I had lost. 4 months passed like this. 4 months of loneliness, exhaustion, and hopelessness. I didn't get a single call from my sons, not one message. It was as if I had died along with Patricia. There were nights when I considered giving up, but something in me, maybe the memory of Patricia, forced me to get up every morning and keep going. It was a Thursday afternoon when my life changed forever. I got a ride notification. Pick up at General Hospital. Destination downtown. It was a short trip, probably $8 or $10. I usually avoided the hospital because of the traffic, but that day I needed every penny. I accepted the ride and drove to the main entrance. I parked in the pickup zone and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to cancel when I saw an old man come out through the glass doors. He was an elderly man, probably my age. He walked slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane that looked old and expensive. He wore a perfectly pressed gray suit, with a navy blue tie and shoes that shined. His hair was completely white, combed back with gel. Everything about him screamed money class. I got out of the car to help him. I opened the back door and extended my hand. He looked up at me, and in that instant, everything changed. He stood completely still, his face transformed into a mask of absolute shock. His eyes, a light, almost transparent gray, went wide. His mouth fell open, and the cane trembled in his hand. I thought he was having a heart attack. I asked him if he was okay, if he needed a doctor. But he didn't answer. He just stared at me as if he were seeing a ghost. Finally he spoke. His voice came out hoarse, thick with emotion. He asked me my last name. I was confused, but I answered. I told him my name was Leo Garcia. The moment he heard that name, his eyes filled with tears, real tears that started to roll down his cheeks. He repeated my last name twice. Garcia, Garcia, as if it were a magic word. Then he asked with a broken voice if I knew a man named Hector Garcia. I felt the world stop. Hector Garcia was my father. He had died 30 years ago from a heart attack. I told him yes, that Hector had been my father. But he passed away a long time ago. The old man closed his eyes tightly. More tears fell. He whispered something under his breath that I couldn't hear. Then he opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression that mixed relief, sadness, and guilt. He told me, his voice firm despite the tears, that he had been looking for my family for 60 years. 60 years. I didn't understand anything. I didn't know this man. I had never seen him before, but he spoke as if he knew secrets about my family that I was unaware of. He asked me to please not go to the original destination, to take him to his office instead. He said there was something he needed to show me, something he had kept for 6 decades, waiting for this moment, something that had to do with my father and a debt that was never paid. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This man, this complete stranger, was crying in front of me, talking about my father as if he had known him intimately, as if he held secrets from 60 years ago. I asked him who he was, what he wanted from me. He wiped his tears with a white handkerchief he took from his suit pocket and apologized for his reaction. He told me his name was Arthur and that what he had to show me would change my life. He asked me to please trust him for just 1 more hour. 1 hour of my time in exchange for answers I had been waiting for my whole life without even knowing it. Something in his voice, in the desperate sincerity of his eyes, made me nod. I helped him into the car. He settled into the back seat carefully, as if every movement caused him pain. He gave me an address in the city center, in the financial district where all the big corporate buildings were. During the ride, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. He stared out the window with a distant expression, lost in memories I couldn't see. The traffic was heavy as always at that hour. It took us almost 40 minutes to get there. I finally stopped in front of a 20-story building with a glass and steel facade. It was the kind of place where important people worked, people with money. Arthur asked me to turn off the engine and come inside with him. I hesitated. I still didn't understand what was going on. But I had come this far, and turning back now seemed foolish. I got out of the car and helped him out. We walked together towards the main entrance. The lobby was impressive. Gleaming marble floors, glass walls, huge decorative plants in ceramic pots. There was a security guard behind a desk who greeted Arthur by name with obvious respect. We went up in an elevator that smelled of expensive wood and luxury air freshener. Arthur pressed the button for the 18th floor. The doors closed, and we began to ascend in silence. I could hear my own breathing. My heart was beating fast. I didn't know if I was making a terrible mistake or if I was about to discover something important. The elevator doors opened directly into a private office. There was no hallway or reception, just a dark wooden door with a golden plaque that read Arthur Mendez, President. He took a key from his pocket and opened the door. He motioned for me to go in first. The office was huge, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city, an antique solid wood desk, shelves filled with leather-bound books, expensive paintings on the walls. Everything screamed success, power, money, accumulated over decades. Arthur closed the door behind us and asked me to sit down. He pointed to a brown leather sofa near the windows. I sat down slowly, feeling completely out of place in my worn-out clothes and old shoes. He walked to a corner of the office where there was a large painting, a seascape in shades of blue. He took it with both hands and moved it to one side, revealing a safe built into the wall. It was old, the kind you see in old movies, with a combination dial in the center and green paint faded by time. He looked at me before opening it. His eyes were wet again. He told me that what he was about to show me had been waiting 60 years for this moment, that he had promised to find the Garcia family and settle a debt that had haunted him his entire life. Then he turned to the safe and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left again. I could hear the metallic clicks of the mechanism. My breathing had become shallow. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt that my life was about to change in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. The safe door opened with a creak of rusty hinges. Arthur reached inside and pulled out an old leather folder, worn at the corners. He placed it on his desk and motioned for me to come closer. I stood up from the sofa, my legs trembling. I walked to the desk and stood in front of the folder. He opened it carefully, as if it were something sacred. Inside were documents yellowed with age, black and white photographs, and what looked like old stock certificates. Arthur took out a photograph and showed it to me. It was of two young men standing in front of a small building. One of them was clearly Arthur, probably 50 years younger, with black hair and a wide smile. The other man made me hold my breath. He looked identical to me. The same eyes, the same nose, the same jawline. He was wearing work overalls and had a hand on Arthur's shoulder in a gesture of friendship. I asked who he was, although I already knew the answer. Arthur confirmed what my heart already knew. That man was Hector Garcia, my father. I sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk. My legs could no longer support me. Arthur sat down too and began to speak. His voice was soft but clear, telling me a story he had kept for 60 years, waiting for the moment to share it. He told me that in 1965, he was a 30-year-old entrepreneur who had inherited a small textile factory from his father. The factory was on the verge of bankruptcy. He had made bad decisions, trusted the wrong partners, and suddenly found himself with huge debts he couldn't pay. The banks had denied him all loans. Creditors were threatening him with lawsuits. He was about to lose everything. One night, desperate, he went to a bar near the factory to drown his sorrows. That's where he met my father. Hector worked as a mechanic in a nearby workshop. He was a simple, hard-working man, with calloused hands and clothes stained with grease, but he had an honesty in his eyes that Arthur had never seen before. They started talking. Arthur, drunk and desperate, told this stranger his whole situation. He told him about the debts, the creditors, how he was about to lose his family's company. My father listened in silence. Then he did something Arthur would never forget. He told him that he had savings, not much, but something. Money he had been saving for years to buy a house someday. He offered that money to Arthur, a complete stranger, to save his company. Arthur thought it was a joke. Nobody did that. Nobody lent their life savings to a stranger in a bar. But my father was serious. 2 days later, they met at a bank. My father withdrew $30,000 from his savings account and gave it to Arthur in cash. $30,000 in 1965. It was a fortune for a mechanic. It was literally everything my father had. Arthur, overwhelmed by the generosity, promised him that he would not only pay back the money with interest, but that he would give him 30% of the company's shares. Once the situation improved, my father would be an official partner. They signed a simple agreement, handwritten on a paper napkin. My father said nothing more formal was necessary. He trusted Arthur. He believed his word. Arthur used that money to pay the most urgent debts. With the financial breathing room, he was able to renegotiate with other creditors. He secured new contracts. The factory not only survived, but began to thrive. In 6 months, it was already profitable. In a year, It had doubled in size. Arthur went to find my father to fulfill his promise. He went to the workshop where he worked. They told him that Hector Garcia had quit 2 months ago. Nobody knew where he had gone. Arthur looked for him everywhere. He went to the address he had on file, but the house was empty. He asked the neighbors. Nobody knew anything. It was as if my father had vanished from the face of the earth. He hired private investigators. He placed ads in newspapers. He offered rewards. Nothing worked. The years passed, and Arthur never stopped looking. His company grew. It became one of the largest textile corporations in the country. And with each passing year, the value of that 30% of shares grew and grew. But Arthur never sold those shares. He kept them in this safe, waiting for the day he could find Hector Garcia or his family. 60 years. 60 years of searching. And today, by pure chance, I had gotten into his car. He had seen my face and immediately recognized the features of his old friend, the man who had saved his life when no one else would give him a chance. Arthur opened one of the documents in front of me. It was a stock certificate in the name of Hector Garcia, 30% of Mendez Textiles Incorporated. Then he took out another, more recent document, a statement of the shares account. The current value, when I saw the numbers, my vision blurred. It couldn't be real. I couldn't be seeing what I was seeing. $32 million. That was the current value of the shares that belonged to my father. $32 million that had been waiting in that safe for 60 years. I couldn't process those numbers. They couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, an elaborate scam. But the documents were there, official, with legal seals and accountants' signatures. Everything was legitimate. Everything was real. My hands trembled as I held the paper. The letters swam before my eyes. Arthur watched me in silence, letting me process the information at my own pace. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was tight. I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. I sat back down in the chair because my legs had stopped working. $32 million. I, who had been surviving on $100 a month for months. I, who ate beans and cheap bread every day. I, who lived in a miserable room the size of a closet. Suddenly, I was a millionaire. Arthur came over and put a hand on my shoulder. He asked if I was okay, if I needed water or something stronger. I shook my head. I didn't need water. I needed to understand. I needed to know why my father had never told me anything about this, why he had disappeared without claiming what was his, why he had died a poor man when he had a fortune waiting for him. Arthur seemed to read my mind because he started talking before I could ask. He told me that over all these years, he had thought a lot about it. He had developed theories about why my father disappeared. Maybe he was afraid of so much money. Maybe he didn't trust the business world. Maybe something personal forced him to leave town quickly. Maybe he was simply a man who valued his peace of mind more than wealth. Arthur never knew the answer. But what he did know was that Hector Garcia was the most honorable man he had ever met. A man who gave everything he had to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. I asked him why he had kept the shares all this time. Why he hadn't sold or used them after so many years without news from my father. Arthur smiled sadly. He told me he had made a promise, that a man without his word is nothing, that all the success he had achieved, all the money he had accumulated, everything he had, he owed to my father. Without that $30,000 in 1965, he would have lost the family business. He would have ended up on the street. My father had given him a second chance when no one else would. The only way to honor that was to keep his promise, no matter how much time passed. He showed me more documents, records of dividends that had accumulated year after year, financial reports showing the company's growth decade after decade, photographs of the factories expanding across the country. Arthur had built a textile empire. Mendez Textiles now had 43 factories in 8 countries. It employed over 20,000 people. It generated revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and 30% of all that had always belonged to my father. I asked him why he had recognized me so easily. 60 years had passed since he last saw my father. Arthur laughed softly. He told me he had never forgotten that face. For decades, he had looked at the photograph he showed me at least once a week. He had memorized every one of my father's features. When he saw me standing next to his car, it was like seeing Hector Garcia resurrected. The same eyes, the same facial structure, even the same way I tilted my head. It was impossible not to recognize me. He knew immediately that I had to be his son. Arthur walked to a window and looked out at the city below. He told me he was 85 years old, that he had been sick for the last 2 years. Lung cancer. The doctors gave him maybe 6 more months to live. He had lost hope of finding the Garcia family before he died. But fate, or God, or whatever it was, had put my car in that exact spot at that exact moment. It was a miracle. The last chance to fulfill the promise he had made 6 decades ago. He turned to me with tears in his eyes. He told me I didn't know how much weight had been lifted off his shoulders. That for 60 years he had carried that debt like a stone in his heart. That every success of his company felt incomplete because he knew he hadn't been able to repay the man who made it all possible. Now he could finally rest in peace. He could die knowing he had kept his word, that the Garcia family would receive what had always belonged to them. I didn't know what to say. The emotions were overwhelming me. I felt gratitude, confusion, sadness, joy, all mixed together in a whirlwind impossible to separate. I thought about my father, about the man I thought I knew. He had been a mechanic his whole life. He worked with his hands until his health no longer allowed it. We always lived modestly, without luxuries, but always with what we needed. He never spoke of this story. He never mentioned Arthur Mendez, or any textile company, or any money owed to him. He died without claiming this fortune. He died in peace, surrounded by his family, in a simple hospital bed, and I never knew he had been a hero to someone. I told Arthur about my father, about how I remembered him. A quiet, hard-working man of few words but strong character, a man who taught me and my brothers the value of honest work, who always said that the most important thing in life wasn't how much you had, but how you treated others, who raised us with discipline, but also with love, who died 30 years ago without me knowing he had ever done something as extraordinary as saving an entire company with his life savings. Arthur listened attentively. When I finished speaking, he nodded slowly. He told me that sounded exactly like the Hector Garcia he remembered. A man who needed no recognition or reward, who did the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do, who valued his integrity more than any amount of money. Men like that were rare. Maybe that's why he disappeared without claiming the shares. Maybe he never cared about the fortune. Maybe he just wanted to help someone in need and then get on with his simple, honest life. Arthur called his secretary on the intercom. A middle-aged woman named Fiona entered the office with a tablet in her hands. Arthur gave her instructions in a low voice. She nodded and left again. He explained that he was contacting his legal team, that we needed to make an official transfer of the shares to my name, that the process would take a few days because of all the required documentation, but he would make sure everything was done correctly. He also told me that I could sell the shares if I wanted, keep them and receive dividends, or any combination of the two. It was entirely my decision. I couldn't think clearly. $32 million. The figure kept repeating in my mind like a broken record. I thought of my miserable room, of my job as a driver, of my sons who had abandoned me. In the last 6 months of suffering and humiliation, all of that had ended in an instant. My life had completely changed in less than an hour. But the strangest thing was that what I felt most wasn't happiness about the money. It was a deep sadness for my father, for not having really known him, for not having known about his heroism while he was alive. Arthur seemed to understand. He told me that what my father had done for him wasn't about the money. It was about character, about kindness, about the will to help another human being in their darkest moment, that couldn't be bought or sold. That was Hector Garcia's true legacy, and that legacy lived in me because I was his son. I carried his blood, his features, probably many of his qualities that I hadn't yet discovered. The money was just the physical manifestation of a moral debt. But the real fortune was knowing I came from such an extraordinary man. I asked if I could keep the photograph, the one of him and my father in front of the factory. Arthur smiled and gave it to me immediately. He told me he had copies, that photograph had been on his desk for 60 years, that he had looked at it thousands of times, remembering the friend who saved his life. Now it was only right that I should have it. I took it with trembling hands and looked at it closely. My father, so young with his whole life ahead of him, smiling sincerely at the camera. He didn't know at that moment that he had just changed someone else's destiny. He didn't know that decades later his act of kindness would still have repercussions. He was just being himself, a good man doing a good thing. Fiona returned to the office, followed by an older man dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Arthur introduced him as Stephen, his personal lawyer, and the company's legal director for 30 years. Stephen greeted me with a firm handshake and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Arthur quickly explained the situation to him. Stephen nodded as if this was something he had been expecting for years. I realized then that he probably knew about this story too, that probably many people in Arthur's inner circle knew about the outstanding debt to Hector Garcia. Stephen opened his briefcase and took out several documents. He explained in a professional but kind voice that they would need my official identification, proof of address, birth certificate, and my father's death certificate to process the legal transfer of the shares. They would also need to do a DNA test to confirm without a doubt that I was Hector Garcia's son. It was standard procedure for transfers of this magnitude. It wasn't that they doubted my identity, but legally they had to cover themselves from any possible future challenges. I told him I understood, that I would do whatever was necessary. Stephen smiled and told me the entire process would take about 2 weeks. In the meantime, Arthur had authorized an advance for me to cover immediate needs, $50,000 that would be deposited into my bank account the next day. I almost fell out of my chair. Pet de niche dollars. It was more money than I had ever seen in my entire life. Stephen handed me bank forms to fill out with my information. My hands were shaking so much I could barely write. Arthur stood up from his chair with effort, leaning on his cane. He walked over to me and extended his hand. When I shook it, he placed his other hand on top, forming a warm, two-handed grip. He looked me straight in the eyes and said something I will never forget. He told me that his life was blessed the day he met my father, that everything good that had happened to him after that encounter in the bar he owed to the generosity of a mechanic who had no obligation to help him, that he had spent 60 years wishing he could look Hector Garcia in the eyes and say thank you, that he couldn't do that anymore, but he was saying it to me. Thank you for being the son of that extraordinary man. Thank you for showing up when I had already lost hope. Thank you for allowing me to die in peace. My voice broke when I tried to respond. I told him I was the one who should be thankful, that I had no words to express what I was feeling. Arthur shook his head. He told me not to thank him, that this wasn't generosity on his part. It was justice. It was fulfilling a promise. It was paying a debt that should have been paid 6 decades ago. He had only been the custodian of something that had always belonged to my family. I spent the next hour filling out forms and answering Stephen's questions. My father's date of birth, place of birth, names of relatives, all the genealogical information I could provide. Stephen took meticulous notes on his tablet. He explained that he would start the legal investigation immediately to ensure there were no other heirs who could claim the shares. I told him I had 2 sons, Moses and Ethan. Stephen wrote down their names and asked if I wanted to include them in the transfer. I was silent for a moment, thinking about them, about how they had treated me, about how they had kicked me out of my own home without remorse. I told Stephen no, that the shares would be transferred only to my name, that I would decide later what to do with the inheritance. Stephen nodded without judgment and noted my decision. Arthur watched me from his chair. I think he understood there was pain behind that decision, but he didn't ask. He just nodded silently, as if giving me his support. When we finished with the paperwork, Arthur insisted that Fiona drive me back to my car, which was parked in front of the hospital. I protested, saying I could take a taxi, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He said he had already waited 60 years. The least he could do was make sure I got home safely. Fiona was an efficient and kind woman. During the drive, she asked if I was okay, if I needed us to stop somewhere. I thanked her but said I just wanted to get to my car. When we arrived at the hospital and I saw my old car parked in the patient pickup zone, I realized something surreal. Just 2 hours ago, I was a desperate driver picking up passengers to survive. Now I was a millionaire. Nothing had changed physically. The car was the same. I was the same, but everything was completely different. Fiona handed me a business card with Stephen's direct number and told me to call him if I had any questions or needed anything. She wished me good luck and left. I stood by my car for several minutes, not knowing what to do. People were coming and going from the hospital. Ambulances arrived with sirens wailing. Life went on as normal, for everyone but me. I took out the photograph Arthur had given me. I looked at my young, smiling father. I tried to imagine the moment he decided to give all his savings to a stranger. What was going through his mind? Whether he was scared, whether he hesitated, or whether he simply saw someone who needed help and acted without thinking too much, because it was the right thing to do. I got in the car and sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel. My phone buzzed with notifications from the app. There were ride requests waiting, people who needed transportation. I looked at the notifications and then looked at the picture of my father. I thought about everything that had just happened, about Arthur crying when he saw me, about the old safe, about the yellowed documents. about the $32 million, about my miserable life for the past few months, about my sons who abandoned me, about Patricia who was no longer here to see this. I started the engine and drove back to my room. The traffic was heavy, and the sun was beginning to set. The city lights were turning on, one by one. I thought about how, in a few weeks, my life would be completely different. I could buy a house, a new car, decent clothes, real food. I could stop working. I could live with dignity for the rest of my days. But the strange thing was that none of those things excited me. The only thing I felt was a deep hole in my chest, a sadness for my father, for not having known who he really was, for not having been able to tell him I was proud of him while he was alive. I arrived at my building when it was already dark. I climbed the stairs to my room on the 3rd floor. I opened the door, and the smell of dampness greeted me as always. I turned on the light and looked around. The unmade bed, the dirty hot plate, the stained walls. Everything looked even more miserable now that I knew I would soon be leaving it forever. I sat on the bed and placed the photograph on the table. I looked at my father for a long time. Finally, I spoke out loud, even though no one else was in the room. I told him thank you. Thank you for being who you were. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for giving me this gift without even knowing it. Thank you for teaching me by your example, even though I didn't understand it until now. I got to my room and put the picture of my father on the small table next to the bed. I stared at it for hours, trying to understand who that man really was. The simple mechanic I knew was only part of the story. There was another dimension to him I had never seen. A man capable of giving everything he had to help a stranger. A man whose act of kindness had traveled through 6 decades to find me in my darkest moment. The hours passed slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Arthur's crying face, the yellowed documents, the impossible numbers. $32 million. The words repeated in my mind like a prayer. I got up several times to check my wallet, to confirm that I had Stephen's card, that it had all been real and not some elaborate dream born of desperation. I made instant coffee on the electric hot plate as the sun came up. It tasted horrible, but it was all I had. At 9 in the morning, I called Stephen. He answered on the second ring with a professional but kind voice. He asked how I was and if I had gotten any rest. I told him the truth, that I had barely slept. He chuckled softly and told me that was completely normal after receiving such shocking news. He confirmed that the $50,000 advance would be deposited into my account that day before noon. He asked if I had an active bank account. I told him yes, although it only had about $15 in it. Stephen asked me to come to his office that afternoon to start the formal paperwork. I needed to bring my official ID, birth certificate if I had it, and any document that proved my relationship to Hector Garcia. I had very little. My worn-out voter ID card, an old birth certificate I had kept for years for no particular reason, and a few pictures of my father from when I was a child. Stephen assured me that would be enough to start. His team would take care of getting the death certificate and other necessary official documents. I spent the morning organizing the few important papers I had. They were stored in a dusty shoebox under the bed. I found the folded and yellowed birth certificate. I found old photos from my childhood, of Patricia when she was young and beautiful, of my sons when they were smiling babies. I found my father's ID, which for some reason I had kept after his death, 30 years ago. Seeing it, I felt a lump tighten in my throat. There he was, younger than I remembered him, looking seriously at the camera with those eyes I now saw every morning in my own reflection. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a bank notification. A deposit of $50,000 had been credited to my account. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. I refreshed the app 3 times in a row to make sure it wasn't a system error. The money was there, real, available. I could withdraw it if I wanted. $50,000 that 24 hours ago would have seemed like an impossible fantasy. I left the room and walked to the nearest bank. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to confirm it physically. The branch was 6 blocks away. I walked in nervously, sweating despite the strong air conditioning. I stood in line, waiting for my turn. When I finally got to the teller, I asked her to check my balance. She typed on her computer and then looked at me with a completely different expression than usual, more respectful, almost reverent. She confirmed the exact amount, $50,215. The $215 was the miserable balance I had before. I asked to withdraw $1,000 in cash. She processed the transaction without asking questions and handed me 10 crisp, new $100 bills. I left the bank with that money in my wallet, feeling like the whole world could see the change in me, even though on the outside I was still the same old man in worn-out clothes and broken shoes. I walked down the main street, looking at everything with new eyes. The shops, the restaurants, people shopping without a care, everything seemed different now that I had money in my pocket. I went into a restaurant I had always looked at from the outside but had never eaten in because the prices were too high for my budget. I sat at a table by the window. I ordered a full breakfast without looking at the price. Scrambled eggs with ham, crispy bacon, toast with butter, freshly squeezed orange juice, real coffee served in a porcelain cup. When the food arrived, I had to hold back tears. It had been months since I'd eaten anything like it. The taste of the salty bacon, the hot, aromatic coffee, the soft, perfect eggs. It all tasted like a blessing, like dignity regained. After breakfast, I walked to a clothing store. I needed something decent to wear to Stephen's office that afternoon. I couldn't show up in the same old, stained clothes I had worn for months of misery. I bought a pair of dark gray dress pants, a clean ironed white shirt, and black shoes that weren't torn or worn out. The total was $180. A week ago, that expense would have destroyed my entire month's budget. Now, I barely felt it. I paid in cash and left the store with the bags in my hand, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt for spending money on myself. I went back to my room and changed. I looked at myself in the small, broken mirror that hung crookedly on the damp wall. In new clothes, I looked different, more dignified, less defeated, less invisible. But I was still me, the same man who had been living in absolute misery, the same man whose sons had abandoned him without a second thought. New clothes didn't change the pain, but it was a start, a first step toward something better. I took a taxi to Stephen's office. It was in the same imposing building where I had been the day before with Arthur, but on a different floor. The elegant receptionist was waiting for me with a professional smile. She led me directly to a large conference room with a mahogany table and leather chairs. Stephen was already seated with several documents organized in front of him. He greeted me warmly, as if we were old friends, and had me sit in the main chair. We spent the next 2 hours going over endless paperwork. He patiently explained each document before I signed it. Sworn statements, official identification forms, authorizations for exhaustive genealogical research, consent for DNA tests. Everything had to be perfect and legal so that no one could question my right to the shares in the future. A medical technician arrived mid-afternoon to take my DNA sample. It was quick and painless. A swab rubbed on the inside of my cheek for 30 seconds, and that was it. Stephen explained that they would compare my DNA with samples obtained from my father's old medical records. The hospital where he died 30 years ago kept files on all deceased patients. It would be enough to confirm the direct genetic relationship without any doubt. The results would take about a week to process. In the meantime, Stephen and his team had begun to dig deep into my father's history. They had found old employment records showing that Hector Garcia did indeed work as a mechanic in several city workshops between 1960 and 1980. They had found his marriage certificate to my deceased mother. They had found our birth certificates, mine and those of my 2 brothers who died young. Everything matched perfectly with the story Arthur had told with tears in his eyes. There was no fraud. There was no mistake. It was all completely legitimate. Stephen asked about my current situation with genuine concern in his voice. I told him everything, not leaving out any painful details. About Patricia and the cancer that took her in 3 months. About Moses and Ethan kicking me out of my own house to sell it. About the miserable room I was living in for $300 a month. About working as a driver at 73 just to be able to eat something every day. He listened in complete silence, occasionally nodding with a serious expression. When I finished my story, Stephen leaned forward and said something that filled me with hope. He told me that all that suffering would be over very soon, that in 2 weeks, at most, I would have full and legal access to the inherited shares, that I could sell them all if I wanted immediate cash, sell just a part, or keep them completely and live off the generous annual dividends. He explained that the annual dividends from that stock package were about $2 million a year. $2 million without having to sell anything, without touching the principal capital. $2 million a year. I, who had lived on a $400 a month pension. I, who had eaten beans and bread for months to survive. I couldn't process those numbers. It was like he was speaking another language. Stephen must have noticed my shocked expression, because he paused and asked if I needed water or a moment to process the information. I nodded, and he called his assistant to bring some cold water. I drank slowly, trying to calm my racing mind. Stephen waited patiently, without pressuring me. When I finally regained some composure, he continued to explain the options. He strongly recommended hiring a trusted personal financial advisor. He gave me a list with the names of 3 professionals who worked with high-net-worth clients, people who could help me manage the fortune intelligently and protect it from bad decisions or scammers who would inevitably appear when they heard about my new situation. He also warned me about something important. He told me not to make hasty decisions driven by the emotion of the moment, not to buy big things immediately, not to tell too many people about the money yet, to let the reality sink in for a few weeks before making drastic changes in my life. He explained that he had seen cases of people who inherited fortunes and lost them in months by making stupid decisions too quickly. He didn't want me to be one of those sad stories. I thanked him for the advice and promised to be careful. Then I asked him something that had been bothering me since the day before. I asked about Arthur, how he was after our meeting, if it had been too much for him emotionally, considering his delicate health condition. Stephen smiled sadly, but also with a hint of peace in his eyes. He told me that Arthur was better than he had been in years, that the cancer was still advancing relentlessly, but now he could face death without that huge weight on his conscience. He told me that Arthur had called his family the night before to share the news, his children and grandchildren. He had told them the whole story of Hector Garcia and how he had finally found his family after 60 years of constant searching. He had cried with happiness on the phone. He had told them he could die in peace, now that he had fulfilled the most important promise of his life. Stephen told me that Arthur was deeply grateful to me for showing up exactly when I did, that he considered it a miracle, the answer to 60 years of desperate prayers. I asked Stephen to tell Arthur something for me, that I too was grateful beyond words, that I understood perfectly what he had done by keeping that promise for 6 decades, that honoring his word in that way was something extraordinary and rare in this world, that my father had chosen well who to help that day in the bar. Stephen promised he would pass on the message word for word. I left the office around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly in the clear sky. The city was buzzing with the heavy rush-hour traffic, thousands of people heading home after work. I walked aimlessly for a good while, just thinking about how my life had completely changed in less than 48 hours, about how my father's act of kindness 60 years ago had traveled through time to rescue me in my darkest, most desperate moment. It was as if he had known somehow that one day I would need that gift, as if he had planted an invisible seed that was finally bearing fruit decades after his death. I stopped in a small square and sat on a bench under a large tree. I took out the photograph Arthur had given me. I looked at my young father smiling next to his friend. 2 men who didn't know they were creating a story that would last a lifetime. I thought about all the times I had watched my father working at the auto shop when I was a kid. His hands always dirty with grease, his stained clothes, his back bent over engines. He never complained. He never spoke of sacrifices. He just did his job day after day with quiet dignity. Now I understood that this humble man had been capable of such great generosity that he had saved another person's life, and he never bragged about it. He never mentioned it. He just went on living his simple, honest life. I wondered why he had never claimed the shares, why he disappeared without seeking what was legally his. Arthur had speculated that maybe he was afraid of the money, that maybe something personal forced him to leave town quickly. But I knew my father better than that. I think he simply didn't care about the fortune. He had helped Arthur because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected a reward. And when he saw that Arthur was okay and the company was thriving, he probably felt his work was done. The money was never the point for him. That made me reflect on myself, on what kind of man I was compared to my father. I had spent the last few months feeling like a victim, blaming my sons, complaining about my luck, sinking into self-pity. But my father had faced difficulties with grace and generosity. He had given when he didn't have to. He had helped when he could have looked the other way. That was the real legacy he left me. Not the money, the example of how to live with honor. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple. I got up from the bench and walked back towards my room. For the last time I climbed those worn-out stairs. For the last time I opened the door that led to my temporary prison. I looked around the miserable room. The sunken bed, the stained walls, the dirty hot plate. In 2 weeks, I would be out of there forever. But strangely, I no longer felt hatred for this place. It had been my refuge when I had nothing else. It had kept me alive during the darkest months. I sat on the bed and looked at my father's picture again. I spoke to him out loud, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I told him I finally understood, that I had lived my whole life without knowing who he really was, that he had given me a gift that went beyond money. He had shown me that true wealth lies in how we treat others, in the kindness we leave in the world, in the promises we keep even when no one is watching. I promised him I would try to be worthy of his legacy, that I would use this gift in a way that would make him proud. That night, I slept better than I had in months, not because I knew I was rich, but because I finally understood something important about my life and about the man who gave me life. I dreamed of my young father working in the shop. In the dream, he turned to me and smiled. He didn't say anything. He just smiled with that calm expression he always had, as if he knew a secret that the rest of the world was unaware of. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I was still living in the same miserable room, but now with $50,000 in my bank account. I was still the same person, but everything had changed internally. I felt different. I walked differently. I no longer dragged my feet with my head down. I looked straight ahead with something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Recovered dignity. A future worth living. Stephen called me every couple of days to keep me updated on the progress. The DNA results had come in. A 99.9% positive confirmation that I was the biological son of Hector Garcia. The legal documents were being processed by notaries and the relevant authorities. Everything was moving forward as planned. In another week, maybe 10 days, the shares would be officially transferred to my name. Then I could decide what to do with them. I spent those days thinking a lot. I walked around the city for hours, reflecting on my life, on the decisions I had made, on the person I had been, on who I wanted to be with this second chance life was giving me. I thought constantly about my sons, about Moses and Ethan, about how they had treated me. Part of me wanted to call them and rub my new fortune in their faces, to show them that I had done well despite them abandoning me. But a wiser part of me knew that would be petty and small. It wasn't what my father would have done. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after meeting Arthur, Stephen called me with news. His voice sounded serious, but with a tone of sadness that made me fear the worst. He told me that Arthur had passed away that morning, peacefully, at his home surrounded by his family. The cancer had finally beaten him, but Stephen assured me that Arthur had died happy. He had fulfilled his promise. He had found the Garcia family. He had paid his debt. His last words had been of gratitude towards my father and me for showing up when I did. I hung up the phone and cried. I cried for a man I had only known for an hour, but who had completely changed my life. I cried for the friendship he had with my father 60 years ago. I cried for the promise kept for a lifetime. I cried for the kindness that still existed in this world, despite everything. Arthur Mendez had been an extraordinary man, and I had been privileged to know him, even if only briefly before he departed. 3 days later, Stephen summoned me to his office for the final transfer. I arrived early, dressed in the clothes I had bought weeks before. The receptionist led me to the same conference room where we had worked before. Stephen was there with 2 other lawyers and a notary public. On the table was a stack of perfectly organized documents. Everything was ready. All that was missing was my signature in the indicated places. We spent an hour signing papers. My hand trembled slightly with each signature. The notary constantly checked my identification. The lawyers explained each document before I signed it. Deeds of transfer of ownership, updated stock certificates, tax documents, bank authorizations. It was overwhelming, but Stephen patiently guided me through each step of the process. Finally, it was all done. The documents signed, the copies certified, everything legal and official. Stephen handed me a thick leather folder with all my original documents. He told me that I was now officially the owner of 30% of Mendez Textiles, one of the main shareholders of one of the largest textile corporations in the country. He explained that the board of directors would want to meet with me soon to introduce themselves formally, that I could attend shareholder meetings if I wanted or appoint a representative, that I would have a voice and a vote in important company decisions. But the most important thing was that I had options. I could sell the shares immediately. Several buyers had already expressed interest in acquiring them. The current market value was $32 million, but I could probably negotiate for more. Or I could keep the shares and receive the annual dividends he had already mentioned, $2 million every year, without touching the principal capital. Or I could do a combination, sell a part for immediate cash and keep the rest for long-term passive income. I told Stephen I needed time to think, that the decision was too big to make impulsively. He completely agreed. He once again recommended I contact one of the financial advisors from his list, that they could help me structure a smart plan based on my needs and life goals. I promised him I would. I left the office with the leather folder under my arm, feeling the weight of what it contained. Not the physical weight, but the emotional weight. Those papers represented the culmination of a story that began 60 years ago. They represented my father's sacrifice, Arthur's gratitude, a promise kept through decades. And now, all of that rested in my hands. It was my responsibility to honor that legacy. I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench. I opened the folder and looked at the documents. My name written on each one. Leo Garcia, owner of millions. It was surreal. A month ago I was driving a taxi 12 hours a day to buy beans. Now I was a millionaire. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel uncontrolled euphoria. I felt something deeper, responsibility, gratitude, a desire to do something meaningful with this gift. I thought about what Arthur had told me that first day, that my father had valued his integrity more than any amount of money, that he had helped without expecting a reward. That was the real message. The money was important. Of course, it would give me security and comfort for the rest of my life. But what was truly valuable was the example my father had set, the lesson on how to live with honor and kindness, even when no one is watching. I took out my phone and looked at my contacts. There were the names of Moses and Ethan. My fingers hovered over the screen. I could call them, tell them everything. Part of me wanted to see their reactions, to see if they regretted how they had treated me, to see if they suddenly wanted to be my sons again now that I had money. But I put the phone away. It wasn't the time. First, I needed to decide what kind of man I wanted to be with this new life. If I wanted to be someone who used money for revenge and to create division, or someone who used it to heal and create something good. I remembered something Patricia used to say, that the true measure of a person is not how they behave when they have everything, but how they behave when they have lost everything. I had lost everything. I had hit rock bottom. I had lived in misery and despair. Now that I was rising again, I had a decision to make. I could become bitter and vengeful, or I could become someone better, someone worthy of my father's legacy. The sun was beginning to set when I finally got up from the bench. I carefully put the folder back in my old backpack. I walked back to my room for the last time. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a new place to live, something decent, something that reflected my new reality. But tonight, I would sleep one last time in that room that had kept me alive during the darkest months, as a farewell, as the closing of a painful but necessary chapter of my life. The next morning, I woke up early with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do. First, get out of that miserable room. Second, contact one of the financial advisors Stephen had recommended. Third, and most difficult, decide what to do about my sons. But that would come later. First, I needed to establish my new life on a solid foundation. I called the first advisor on the list, a man named Robert Sandoval with 30 years of experience managing large estates. His assistant gave me an appointment for that same afternoon. Then, I searched online for apartments for rent in decent areas of the city. I found a furnished 2-bedroom in a modern building with security. It cost $1,200 a month. 2 months ago, that price would have seemed impossible. Now, it was perfectly reasonable. I called the owner, and we agreed to meet the next day. The meeting with Robert was eye-opening. He was a man in his 50s, bald, with glasses, and a clear, direct way of speaking that I liked immediately. He didn't use complicated language or try to impress me with technical terms. He spoke to me like an intelligent human being. I told him my whole story from the beginning. Patricia, my sons, the miserable room, Arthur, the shares, everything. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment before speaking. He told me I had 2 main options. The first was to sell all the shares immediately. That would give me about $32 million in cash. With a conservative and diversified investment, I could live comfortably for the rest of my life with an annual income of about $1.5 million without touching the principal. The second option was to keep the shares and live off the annual dividends of $2 million. The benefit was that the value of the shares would continue to grow over time. He recommended a third option, which was a hybrid. Sell 50% of the shares to have $16 million in immediate liquidity. Invest $10 million conservatively to generate passive income. Keep $6 million as an emergency reserve and for major expenses. And keep the other 50% of the shares to continue receiving annual dividends of $1 million. That way, I would have the best of both worlds. Immediate financial security, but also long-term growth. The proposal made perfect sense. I told him to proceed with that plan. Robert began to explain the next steps. He would contact potential buyers for the shares. He would negotiate the best possible price. He would structure the investments in a diversified portfolio of bonds, index funds, and real estate, all designed to minimize risk while generating steady income. He told me the process would take about a month to complete fully. During that month, my life changed in ways I never could have imagined. I moved into the new apartment. It was beautiful, clean, bright, with large windows that let in the sun. It had a real kitchen where I could actually cook, a private bathroom with constant hot water, a comfortable bed that didn't have springs digging into my back. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up in pain. I bought new clothes, not expensive designer clothes, but decent, comfortable clothes. I bought real food, fresh meat, vegetables, fruits, things I had forgotten existed. Every meal felt like a small celebration. I regained the weight I had lost. My face stopped looking gaunt and gray. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself I thought I had lost forever. But with every little luxury I allowed myself, I thought of my sons. Moses and Ethan knew nothing about my new situation. They still thought I was a poor old man driving a taxi to survive. Part of me wanted to keep it that way, to leave them in their ignorance. But a larger part of me knew that I would eventually have to face them. Not for them, but for me. To close that painful chapter somehow. One afternoon I received an unexpected call. It was Ethan, my younger son. His voice sounded awkward and forced. He asked how I was. It was the first time he had called me in 4 months. I told him I was fine. There was a long silence. Then he told me that he and Moses had been talking, that maybe they had been too hard on me, that they wanted to invite me to dinner to talk. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to believe he was sincere, that they really regretted it. But something in his tone made me doubt it. I accepted the invitation. We agreed to meet at a restaurant the next day. I hung up the phone with mixed feelings, hope mixed with cynicism. I wanted my sons to love me for who I was, not for what I had. I decided not to mention anything about the money at dinner. I wanted to see their true intentions first. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was a modest Mexican place we used to visit when they were kids. That gave me some hope. Maybe they had chosen that place specifically for the memories. Moses and Ethan arrived together 5 minutes later. They looked uncomfortable. We greeted each other with awkward hugs and sat at a table in the back. The first few minutes were filled with superficial conversation. The weather, the traffic, meaningless small talk. Then Moses took a deep breath and began to speak. He told me they had been thinking a lot, that maybe they had acted hastily after Mom's death, that they understood it had been hard for me too. Ethan nodded, adding that they felt some guilt about how they had handled the house situation. I waited. I knew something else was coming, and it came. Moses said they had thought of a solution, that if I needed a place to live, they could rent me the maid's room at Ethan's house for $350 a month. They could help me out that way. It would be better than where I was now, surely. Ethan quickly added that, of course, I would have to help with some household chores. Nothing heavy, just light things like taking care of the garden or washing the car occasionally. I felt something cold settle in my chest. There it was. It wasn't real regret. It wasn't fatherly love. It was convenient guilt mixed with the possibility of cheap labor. They were offering me to live in a servant's room as a domestic employee for my own son. They thought they were being generous. They thought they were doing me a huge favor. I looked at both of them. I saw their expectant faces. They were waiting for gratitude. They expected me to fall all over myself with thanks for their magnanimous offer. A strange calm came over me. I smiled and told them I appreciated the offer, but it wouldn't be necessary, that I had found a decent place to live. Moses frowned, asking how I could afford it on my pension. I simply told him I had been lucky, that things had improved for me recently. Ethan asked what I meant by that, if I had won the lottery or something. He laughed, as if it were an impossible joke. I didn't laugh. I told them in a calm voice that I had discovered something about their grandfather, Hector. Something we never knew, something that had completely changed my life. Their expressions changed from condescending to curious. Moses asked what I was talking about, and then I began to tell them the story of Arthur, of the bar in 1965, of the $30,000, of the shares kept for 60 years, of the $32 million that were now mine. The silence that followed my words was absolute. Moses and Ethan stared at me with their mouths open, unable to process what they had just heard. $32 million. The words hung in the air between us like something impossible. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice came out trembling, asking if I was joking. I told him no, that it was completely real, that I had all the legal documents to prove it. Moses leaned forward, his eyes shining. He started talking fast, almost tripping over his words. He said it was incredible, that the family had received a huge blessing, that we had to celebrate, that we needed to make plans on how to manage all that money together, as a family. Ethan chimed in enthusiastically, adding that they could help me manage it, that I shouldn't worry about a thing, that they would take care of me and the fortune. I watched them talk faster and faster, making plans, suggesting investments, mentally calculating how much each of them would get, and I felt a deep sadness in my heart. Not sadness for me, but for them, for what they had become, for how money had instantly transformed their contempt into false affection. 5 minutes ago, they were offering me a servant's room as if it were charity. Now they wanted to manage my fortune as a united family. I raised my hand, interrupting them. The silence fell again. I told them, my voice calm but firm, that I needed them to listen to something important. When you kicked me out of my house 4 months ago, when you told me to find an apartment on my miserable pension, when you abandoned me without a second thought, I hit rock bottom. I lived in a room the size of a closet that smelled like damp. I ate beans and bread for months because it was all I could afford. I worked 12 hours a day as a driver at 73 years old just to survive. In all that time, in those 4 months of absolute suffering, I didn't receive a single call from you. Not one message asking how I was. Not even on your mother's birthday, which was 2 months after she died. Nothing. Total silence. You erased me from your lives as if I had never existed. As if 40 years of being your father meant absolutely nothing. Moses tried to interrupt, but I continued. Today, when you called me after 4 months, I had hope. Stupid hope that maybe you had genuinely regretted it, that maybe you missed me, that maybe you wanted your father back. But no. You offered me a servant's room in exchange for domestic work. As if I were an employee and not your father. As if that was generosity and not further humiliation. Ethan started to stammer excuses. That I didn't understand. That they had good intentions. That it was difficult for everyone. I raised my hand again, stopping him. I understand perfectly, I said. Actions speak louder than words, and your actions over the past 4 months have shown me exactly who you really are. Moses changed tactics. His voice became pleading. He said they had made mistakes, that they were human, that they deserved a second chance, that we were family, and family forgives each other. I nodded slowly. You're right, I told them. Family should forgive. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, nor does it mean pretending nothing happened. True forgiveness requires genuine acknowledgement of the harm caused and a real change in behavior. I don't hate you. I probably will be able to forgive you in time. But right now, I need distance. I need to build my new life without the toxicity of relationships based on material interest. You will not see a single cent of this money. It is my inheritance from my father. I will decide what to do with it, and my decision does not include rewarding you for abandoning me in my most vulnerable moment. My son's face is transformed. The mask of regret fell, revealing the fury beneath. Moses slammed the table with his open palm, making the silverware jump. He said it was unfair, that they were my sons, that they had a right to a part of that inheritance, that they could legally fight for it. I remained calm. Legally, you have no right, I told them. The shares are in my name exclusively. My lawyers have already made sure of that. You can try to sue if you want, but you will only lose money on legal fees. Ethan tried a different approach, a soft voice and teary eyes. He said he was sorry for everything, that if he could go back in time, he would do things differently, that he loved me and the money didn't matter, he just wanted his father back. I wanted to believe him. God knows how much I wanted to believe him. But I had learned something important in these months of suffering, that words are easy. Actions show the truth, and their actions for 4 months had been of total abandonment. I got up from the table. I took out my wallet and left enough money to cover my share of the bill for the food we never ordered. I told them I hoped one day they would understand, that what my father taught me by his example was not about accumulating wealth, but about living with integrity, about helping others without expecting a reward, about keeping promises even when no one is watching. That was the true legacy I had received. The money was just a symbol of something much bigger. I told them the doors weren't closed forever. that if one day they showed genuine remorse, if they proved with actions and not just words that they had changed, maybe we could rebuild something. But it would be on my terms. Not out of obligation or for money, but because they genuinely wanted to have a real relationship with me. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I heard Moses shouting something behind me, but I didn't stop. I got into my car, a new one I had bought the week before, and drove back to my apartment. For the first time in months, I felt free. Free from the pain, free from expectations, free from the need for approval from people who didn't deserve it. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of real coffee, looking at the city lights. I thought about my father, about Arthur, about the promise kept for 60 years, about how one act of kindness can travel through time, creating ripples that touch lives decades later. My father never knew that his generosity would eventually save me, but it did, and now it was my turn to decide what I would do with that gift. I decided to create a foundation in my father's name, the Hector Garcia Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly people in need. People like I had been just months ago, homeless, hopeless, abandoned by their families. We would give them dignified housing, food, medical care, but above all, dignity, because I had learned that losing your dignity hurts more than losing money. Not all the money would go to the foundation. I would live comfortably, travel, enjoy the years I had left, but a significant part would be dedicated to continuing the legacy of kindness that my father began 60 years ago in a bar when he gave everything he had to a stranger without a second thought. Some debts are too big to be paid with money alone, but sometimes money is the only way left to say thank you. Thank you, Dad, for teaching me that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what you give. Thank you, Arthur, for keeping your promise when it would have been easy to forget. And thank you to life for giving me this second chance to live with purpose and meaning. I will dedicate the rest of my days to honoring the legacy of two extraordinary men who showed me that kindness never dies. It just waits for the perfect moment to bloom.
Did you enjoy my story? What a journey it has been. I truly wonder, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, or would you have done what I did to reclaim your dignity? Let's meet in the comments below. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. I'm reading every single one. Which city are you listening from tonight? If my story resonated with you, you can support me and help me bring more stories like this to the world by sending a super thanks. Your sweet support means the world to me and allows me to continue this journey with all of you. On the screen now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There are so many more on my channel, each with its own lessons and triumphs. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for being here with me. Until the next story, with love and respect.